cloud. All right. So let me share my screen and we'll start. I need to practice Zoom. Slideshow. Here we go. Can everyone see what I'm sharing?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep. Yes.
So welcome to our June Orchid Chat for Niños. This month we're going to be talking all about native orchids. And I wanted to start off displaying one of my favorite native orchids, actually the first native orchid I ever saw. One of the first orchids I ever saw in person. These wonderful lady slippers. These were actually off a trail up in Lake George, and there were 4,000 of them. We met someone along the way who was a counter, and she counted. So I was very excited we had an accurate count. But so sometimes you get lucky and you see great things like this. Our state is full of wonderful plants.
Definitely. So New York has orchids, believe it or not. We grow a lot of tropical orchids and think of them more as tropical indoor houseplants, but there are actually 76 orchid species and varieties that have been collected and vouchered. That means that they were collected, identified, and then pressed, and they're kept in an herbarium. All these other plants from New York State. About 70 of these are considered native in the state. A lot of them are considered state or federally rare, and a lot of them have a very specific distribution. So they have areas that they like, and I think that first picture shows it beautifully, that even though they have kind of specific areas that they prefer, they can be found in abundance in those, and there's a lot that can be found throughout upstate New York.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that you can find them kind of in those times where they have so much abundance is because our native orchids can produce 8,000 to 10,000 seeds, which is super, super cool. The thing is that these seeds are like very, very, very small, and they don't really include much of an energy reserve, which is kind of also why they're so small. So a lot of these seeds rely on their weather and their landing conditions to get growing. They also rely a lot on these kind of fungal associations. So basically, you're the seed, you've been produced, great, oh my gosh, you're flying through the air. If you're lucky, maybe it's kind of a damp day. Maybe you're landing in a nice damp spot, like it could be flat with just a little bit of a dip, and you've landed in the dip. You're awesome. It's great. And there's some mycorrhizae fungi that you can kind of grab onto, and you are good to go. And you're very lucky because most of you, like your other seedlings, are not going to make it. This kind of is great for explaining our orchid group sizes, like on the first slide where there's so many of them, but also when you find just a couple because they're really specific. And a lot of these orchids, to even make these seeds, rely on deception. So they're kind of tricking a lot of these pollinators to pollinate them. And kind of going on about, just to kind of get us into it, our first orchid is Lady Slipper. There are 5 different species, and the Latin here is Cypripedium. It's actually, the Greek translation goes into Aphrodite's shoe, which also explains our English common name, Lady Slipper. So this one's really kind of great to identify because of its really big leaves and these big showy flowers. As you can kind of see from, like, especially this photo here in the right-hand corner, you know, there's a lot of woods and green and trees, but then you have this big whiteness and you can't really miss it. And here are some other ones that you definitely cannot miss. I went out botanizing yesterday with some lovely ladies in this club.
Wow.
And we were lucky enough to see some of these showy lady slippers. And we were out, and they were really great because they were a little obvious with the white and the pink. They are beautiful, though. New York has a lot to offer.
Another group that we wanted to highlight is Spiranthes. This is a less commonly known genus, I think, but we've got around 14 species that are native to New York. And even more, there's been a lot of kind of taxonomic arguing, trying to decide exactly what classifies as a species and whether these very distinct geno and phenotypes should be recognized as different species. They're named for their spiral pattern. So on the Spiranthes lacera var gracilis there, you can really see that distinctive spiral pattern. But they've got just such amazing architecture, and they're just really nice plants, really gorgeous to grow, and they provide a lot of that structure. And they're fairly large too. I think they can get up to 3 feet. And again, I think a lot of people, when they think of native orchids, they don't think that they're, as showy as our indoor house plants. And we have a few Plantathera examples here. So this is another large section of orchids called Plantathera. We actually have one species that is endemic to New York State, Plantathera pallida, that's only found on Long Island. So that is super cool. There's a lot of these that are endangered and rare. There's 18 species and a whole bunch of natural hybrids too. So I added Plantathera bicolor on this slide to kind of show that there are hybrids that happen in nature. And then on our next slide, I'll show you that not all Plantathera are boring. There's a lot of really interesting and very colorful Plantathera. So Plantathera solaris is a bright orange, just a gorgeous flower. Plantathera leucocephala is a drier plant that has a beautiful fringy lip. And then Plantathera psychoides, which I believe is the lesser purple fringed bog orchid. Another just gorgeous color, big showy flowers.
And kind of going along with how exciting they are, she talked about the lesser purple fringed orchid. This is the larger purple fringed orchid. This is great for bog gardens. It's found along marshes and streams and bogs. But these guys can reach up to 4 feet in the right conditions in the right location. I wanted to highlight that with this photo on the right here. It's massive, and they're also very interesting to look at. I think they look like little fish.
They do. You can see like the fins and the eyes and everything.
Fish.
It's cool.
So this is one of our non-native orchids. It's also got a really interesting flower, but it's really common. So this is Apotactus hellebore, the broad-leaved hellebore, also known as the weed orchid. When I was kind of learning about this, it was really interesting because on Google, one of the prompts that comes up is people asking, how can I get rid of the weed orchid in my yard? And it was like, oh, what a problem to have. You lucky people. A great one about this is that it was actually first documented, I think in America in 1879 in Syracuse. And since 1879, it has spread all over, all the way to Minnesota and as south as southern tip of PA. This one can also grow pretty tall in the right conditions, but it's pollinated by wasps. And the reason it's so common is because it really likes disturbed soils. So a lot of urban areas where they're building, moving things around, it's not always settled. They really like the conditions are just right for those seeds to land.
Yeah, it's a pretty common one that you can find in like your gardens too sometimes. Next is Calopogon tuberosus, or grass pink. This is just, a stunner. If you go out to a bog and you find this plant, it's a good day. They're excellent for bog gardens. They're found in bogs and on coastal areas. They really like that wet environment, and they like a lot of sun too. They can be found throughout upstate New York and the Adirondacks. Calopogon is Greek for beautiful beard, and it's hard to see in this picture, but they have kind of a fringed yellow tips on their lip. They almost have a similar flower to, just blanked out on our other plant that we grow. But they've got a really interesting flower. They can produce a very large inflorescence, and they can grow up to 4 feet tall too. So they're a pretty large plant. And then they're named grass pink because they have very long, strappy grass-like leaves.
Another one that kind of is long and strappy. The leaves aren't, but the plant itself is very slender. Is Pogonia ophio, the rose pogonia. Latin today is not coming out.
Ophioglossoides.
Love that. Thank you. So
Stay
this
with enough.
is another one that, aside from being hard to pronounce, is easy to find in bogs, in these kind of wet, low, kind of nutrient areas. They're often found next to carnivorous plants. I actually found some buds of these guys yesterday, and they were next to a lot of sundews, which were beautiful. So these rose begonias are named for their rose-colored flowers. You kind of dissect the Greek. It's also kind of bearded, but it more means like the bearded snake's tongue, which you can really see on this lower photo to the left here. That kind of really fringed snake-like tongue coming out. These guys are pretty small. They're tough. When they bloom, they're a lot easier to spot.
They don't have much before bloom either. They're just kind of a green stem with a single leaf on them.
Yeah, tough to find. These guys are less tough to find though, right, Elise?
Hopefully. So this is Goodyeara pubescens, or downy rattlesnake plantain, and they are distributed throughout New York State. I don't know if I've seen one yet. I've been looking for them for a while, but they're, another one that's rare, but in habitats that they like, they're pretty common. They're found in dry to moist soils and deciduous to and coniferous forests. Even though they're widespread, they're still a vulnerable species. And they have the common name, the downy rattlesnake plantain, because, well, for one, their leaves are kind of soft, and they resemble common plantain leaves of another plant. They have a very large, rounded basal rosette with distinct white veins that's really comparable to a lot of the jewel orchids that we see. And then the flower spikes can be really large in comparison to the plant. They can be up to 18 inches tall. And they bloom kind of like on that top picture on these large kind of white spikes.
Interesting.
They're kind of ghostly when you look at them.
Yeah, they kind of are. It would be really cool to kind of stumble upon a patch like that in the woods too.
It'd be cool to stumble upon a patch of any orchid.
It's always a good day.
Especially like these guys too. Oh, will you do this one? I was going to do this one. I don't know.
Either one.
But so these guys are the showy orchid. These are found in deciduous woodlands. Another one that's great to identify with these kind of big orchid-like leaves. When you see the flowers, it's like also really stands out against what's going on in the world around it. They're spotted with like calcareous rocks, but they've been found a lot to associate with. Even though they're in these rocky spots, they still survive. That's the conditions they like. They're very short, and they get pollinated by bumblebees. A great tip for finding these, though, is that they don't really handle competition well. They're kind of like, it's me, only me, which is a very showy personality for these showy orchids. I think it fits them perfectly.
The drama queens.
Definitely are. But they can be found with species like Jack in the Pulpit, but they're not in plants as like places with a lot of other different types of plants.
And then the last orchid we'll talk about is Calypso bulbosa, or the fairy slipper orchid. So this is an orchid that was historically found and documented in New York State, but in the past, I think about 20 years, there are no known wild plants left. So it's a really just sad tale, and we kind of wanted to include this to be aware of things like this. Also, if you find this in the wild, tell someone, because that would be huge. So they were largely extirpated or locally extinct due to collecting. There's actually around 40 herbarium specimens. So these were botanists that were collecting and identifying the species, and they're full plant specimens. So they're flowers, roots, leaves, everything from a single population in, I think it was in Broome County. So it was in the southern tier. And then they were also widely collected and widely harvested for people to plant in their gardens. And unfortunately, they don't transplant well because they have these mycorrhizal associates that they really rely on. They're slow growers, so that also kind of puts a damper onto the transplanting. So if you're looking to incorporate plants in your garden, you have to be careful to source them from reputable nurseries that aren't taking plants from the wild. And this kind of ties into where we're going next about incorporating orchids in your environment.
Yeah, you got this, Elise. Keep going. I'm pumped. Tell me about it.
Okay, so if you're interested in including these orchids in your landscape, you can create something called a bog garden, or really any wet area. You can incorporate them. So you need an area that's wet, and you can either create that or use an existing wet area in your yard. You want to put it in a spot that you like, that you'll enjoy, that you'll go out to, that you'll look at, because what's the point of having a beautiful garden if you're never going to enjoy it? You can also extend out a pond or add it to a pond and create these like biological filters and add plants to kind of act as a natural filter. And then you also want to plant it around the plants that you want to put into it. So research your plants, build a garden, put it in. It's great. Why would you do this? Because they have huge benefits. You know, native plants, this is my little soapbox for native plants. You should always be using native plants, but they really provide a backbone for the ecological community around you. So it's so important to incorporate these native plants into your environment and into your backyard. It's great for attracting a ton of wildlife, birds, frogs, toads, snakes, insects, so many more things. If you build it, they will come. And then the other thing that it can be really beneficial, a lot of people are a little afraid about like the insects. They don't want to attract bugs to your yard, but you can actually utilize some of these native insects as integrated pest management. So a lot of our native wasps that are big pollinators here provision their young with caterpillars. So if you have, let's say, a huge cabbage patch and they're getting overrun by cabbage moths, these wasps will go around and pick off the cabbage moths and eat them, or the cabbage moth caterpillars, and eat them. And you have a little less work. You don't have to use any herbicides or pesticides or anything. And it's better for the environment. And then as far as upkeep, the main thing, the one thing you always want to do is keep this area wet. Use rainwater or, filtered water, hose water, whatever you need to do to keep it moist year round. The other thing that you might need to do on a less frequent basis is manage the plant species in there. So, if you plant Rudbeckia in there one year and then it's taken over the next year, you might need to selectively weed or thin out or deadhead your plants, just to make sure you create that diversity and maintain the look that you're going for. And then the other thing that you might need to do is add additional organic matter. Bogs can be really rich in organic matter and might need a little extra help if you're incorporating it into your backyard.
They are a big labor of love, definitely. So kind of going along with that, you're like, great, I know all this stuff about fall gardens. I'm pumped. I'm gonna make mine. It's just a little bit more about kind of what you're picking and how you're doing it. Um, so great one to do is pick up like I don't know why it says poorly. That's not true. You wanna pick a spot that's already damp, which is really cool because sometimes it just happens. I work on a campus, and it's been really interesting because in the 2 years I've worked there, I've seen two different bogs, basically, well, not bogs, wetlands, just create themselves. Like at one point, it was a nice field, and then it just got wet, and then it got wetter, and then all of these wetland species just took off around it. So if you have a spot in your yard that's getting wet and wetter, use that. Go for it. Get into it. Maybe dig a little hole. For any of them, you're going to dig a little hole. You're going to want to line it. You can use like some sort of tub and make it more of an enclosed pond. You can use a liner. If it's already a wet area, if you're adding it onto a pond or something, you can kind of just use the earth as long as it's a spot that does drain, because you don't want your water to get stagnant. You want to keep it moving, or at least kind of have an outlet. And you also want to look at your soil. There are a lot of like Cornell Cooperative Extension has they actually have an office in Rensselaer. I think they just moved to Latham, that you can send soil samples into and they'll analyze it. And there are other ways you can do it, but check out what you've got going on. If you don't have the right mix, you want to add like some peat, sand, silt, clay. Just get a really rich kind of soil going on and make it right for whatever conditions you need to keep this water and also keep it moving at the same time. You want to add your organic matter in there, definitely, to begin with. Give it like a nice base, give it something to work off of. You can experiment with the soils in your yard, which is also sending them in. Because some of what you have could be just too nutrient poor for these carnivorous plants and some of your orchids. And the vegetation also you want to pick. You want some tall stuff, some short stuff. This is more aesthetic. But it does make a difference too for those like insects and the wildlife that's going to be living there, providing a habitat for them. I'm a big fan of plants that bloom throughout the year. I'm not really big into summer or spring gardens. I like it's very cold in New York for a very long time, so I like to pick stuff. We're going to use all of those seasons for flowers, really. And you want to mix your textures. You want sedges, rushes, grasses. But then again, as we said, you want to pick your plants carefully. You want to go to trusted places that are going to ethically source them, and make them right for your conditions as well.
And then another thing, if you're interested in native orchids, you can go botanizing. Going out and seeing orchids in habitat is amazing. Recommend it for everyone. If you can get out there, definitely try to go find orchids. And I think it gives more appreciation for, the wild world around you. And then you can also use that to bring back home and maybe incorporate some of the plants that you see in your own habitat and in your own backyard. So as far as what you need to go botanizing, you need a good attitude and ambition. You should have an idea of what you're looking for. You can, wander through the woods and you might find some stuff, but I think it definitely helps to know what you want to look, or have a few target species, have a few target plants that you're really looking for. And then that also helps researching plants, finding areas that would have good habitat for these plants. There's actually the New York Floral Atlas that has a list of New York orchids and all the other plants that have been found and documented in New York State. It's a great resource and I would highly recommend it. The other thing that's very useful when you're out in the field is an ID resource. There's Go Botany that has online keys, so they're dichotomous keys. So they'll give you does it have these leaves or these leaves? And you can kind of click through and it'll give you a select plant list, and it'll give you a kind of idea of what plants you might be seeing. There's also Newcomb's Wildflower ID book, or you could use a specialized orchid ID book or a specialized general plant ID book. A walking stick is always useful, having some sort of thing to poke things with, especially when you're in a bog. You can kind of test where it might be deeper than it looks, and test where it's stable. They're also good for long hikes, something to rest on, or even if you're doing stream crossings, walking sticks or trekking poles are always really helpful with that. Having a map, knowing where you're going, always good. A friend, buddy system still applies, and water, especially for these longer, if you're going to be out in the field all day looking at plants, hydration is necessary.
A great example of all of these are some pictures from the trip I took yesterday. So it kind of brings it to what you're really doing. I mean, you're in these weird spots, very left-hand one, that's Jade Watt. And we had found an orchid and she's taking a photo of it, but it's on this mound here. It's very small. I think I can almost highlight it. But this was a really wet area. A lot of these kind of mounds were actually, they depressed. They were rotten logs and it looked like logs, but when you stepped on them, you just sunk. Over here in the middle photo, we're in another, it's a very boggy bog, a proper bog. You know, my feet were wet, we're in the mush. And then on the right here too, I mean, there you're in the woods, you're tromping around the woods, there's bugs, there's a lot going on. This was a great one. On the left here, we had Janet, and she had just found an orchid. It is hanging out somewhere down here by her feet, but this is a great example of where we are. And on the right-hand side, there's me. Not with orchids, but with what we did find. We actually went back later and found some photos of previous years and realized that there were a lot of orchid remnants that we hadn't been able to spot, which is another really important part of knowing what you're looking for. But also shows a variety of places. Like we tromped through a stream to get here. We were knee deep in water. It was great. So when you're out there, what are you looking for? So you're going to look for leaves. That's a really kind of great thing because you're in some weird spots and there's a lot of vegetation. So what are you really looking for? A lot of orchids have these kind of larger orchid leaves, which makes them easy to spot. A lot of them have these large, flat, literally laterally veined leaves, which is a great distinguishing characteristic from other plant species. Like we were out yesterday and the orchid, we found lady slipper leaves, and the veining on them was a lot different than another very similar leaf, which only had one main vein. So those are kind of the easier ones. Some of these other orchids can be harder to find, like the grass pink. We have one over here. It's in the scrub shrub swamp. There's a lot of these kind of low growing shrubby trees. It's going to be tougher to see, especially if there's no flower. Which brings us to the next point. So maybe there are flowers out. That's great. That's very lucky. You should really research the bloom time for the orchid you're looking for. Some are a little earlier, some end up a little later. Some have single flowers, some have larger spikes, and some are a little unsuspecting. This is a really great example. This is our northern tuberclid orchid. And then this is some close-ups of the spike and some close-ups of the flower. But in the middle here, we have it in a habitat. You're walking along. If you're not looking, you might miss this guy. So you want to really scan. Put those peepers on high vision. Your high beams are on, you're looking.
There's something we call botanizer pace, which is pretty much like you shuffle along until you find a plant and then you sit down next to the plant and you like ID it and everything. So it can be frustrating if you're with people that are just there to hike or to go, but it's definitely worth it.
It's a tough pace to kind of get to. I found myself yesterday. A lot of the time, I was definitely just kind of walking around, really just enjoying being in the bogs, getting all wet and sloshing around. But there were times when I realized I was like, if I want to find these plants, because other people were finding them, and I said, I want to be like them. I had to like really slow down and look.
我不吃呢，半只鸭子没什么肉。
So these are actually photos from yesterday too. So this is kind of some of the tragedy. You came too early. Your orchids are still in bud. And it's a little tougher to find these guys because we still have all this greenery and the buds are green too. So maybe like these showy lady slippers, you're lucky and there are some leaves that you can see and pick them out. And they're a little taller. So on the left here, this is one that's not even produced more of that plant to come into bud. And on the middle, we've got one that's got a bud coming out. And then all the way on the left, this is a different kind of orchid. This is still in bud. No, these are seed pods. Oh, I'm a little late on that one. But that brings us to our next point. So maybe you go and oh darn, you just missed them. That happened to me last year. So some native orchids past peak. This one has a little bit of a sad flower. Sometimes you'll see the sad flowers, but other times you'll see the flower spike with nothing on it. Maybe the deer have already chomped them. A lot of times you'll see just the leaves. So those are things you want to be on the lookout for. So it's also, so maybe you want to go out there and botanize. There's time. There's still time right now. You could go out this weekend. This is a great time to botanize. So some great places where lady slippers are present in the capital region. The Saratoga Sands Plain Wildlife Management Center has some. If you walk in, you go along the back, along the wooded area, there are some lady slipper, which is, I think, the single one that I took. I think that was one of like the first orchids I ever actually saw. I was walking along and I had read an orchid book and I was like, oh my gosh, there they are. It was great. But also in Greenfield, we've got the Woods Hollow Nature Preserve, also has lady slippers. In the Adirondacks, there's an orchid loop where you can see some really big clusters like this. That's where I saw 4,000. That's at DeBar Mountain Wild Forest. But there are a lot of other spots. You just got to keep your eyes open. You got to know your plants, target, preferred conditions, distribution. You got to get out. Some places are you're just pulling off the side of the road and you're just like, this is where my plant likes to be, and you're just out there.
Yeah, and as far as botanizing, it can really be anything. You can be on a designated trail or you can be on the side of the road. It's, whatever you're comfortable with. Make sure you're not going onto private land or anything, but other than that, it can be as much or as little as you want to do.
The only rule is not to be on private property.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And then, so right before we say thank you and ask if anyone has questions, we do have this great video to kind of sum up some of our lovely native orchids. I might fast forward a little bit. So this was,
You can't see the video. It's still on the PowerPoint.
That is so sad. Well, the link will be there and I'll include it. Where is my share? I'll include it in the thing that goes out in the link description. But that's a great one of an orchid actually being pollinated in New York State.
That was a video that you took, right?
Yes, it is. I took it myself with my camera, and my camera makes it look like it was taken in 2004. Taken last year, June 8th.
It's also on the Ninos, our YouTube, right?
Yep, I uploaded it, so
Okay.
It's there. So I'm going to send out this link, or you could go through the Ninos YouTube and find it yourself. But it is there, and it's very, very cool to see some of these plants in action.
Yeah, very interesting.
I guess we'll open it up now. If anyone has any questions or wants to participate or tell us about times botanizing.
Do you guys know any reliable local sources for native orchids?
As far as buying them from a nursery, I
Yeah.
unfortunately don't. They're fairly hard to come by in cultivation. So you really have to be on the lookout. I know the Central New York Orchid Society had a grower that I think he's moved down to North Jersey now, but he was very interested in growing native orchids. And I think Stan Lee has an interest in native orchids, so he might know some people too. But I don't have any of that.
There was a grower, I think in Vermont a few years ago, who was selling yellow lady slippers, the large lady slippers, which
Yeah.
were supposedly, carefully cultivated and everything, but I haven't seen anything from them lately, and I can't even remember the name.
I know
But-
there was a place in Connecticut a few years ago too, but I haven't looked recently.
Yeah,
But they were like, they were cypripediums and they were like $150 a piece as well.
they were very
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah,
yes.
that's the other hard part, that if you
Yeah,
find
expensive orchids. Who would ever thought? Yeah.
So yes, test your soil because you don't want to do too much.
yeah,
Yeah,
Just see if
yeah.
I kill it or not,
it's not a plant that you test
No.
with and try out.
Yeah,
So
I
in
have.
build- Oh, okay, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was thinking in building a bog garden, how do you account for the fungi that you might need to keep them going? And do you talk about a calcareous soil? How do you know when your bog has the right pH, or what pH should you have? I mean, you could dig a hole in the ground and put some plants in, but you may not be as successful as just throwing them in your garden. So it seems like there's a little bit more work for the orchids because they're so specific. Just wondered if any of you have a bog garden, or have any other ideas about how to keep them alive from year to year.
So I've made a few bog gardens, and normally when I make wetter gardens, I don't add orchids or super sensitive species. I'm looking at plants, around me and that I'm interested in growing. So I do it with kind of more common plants like jewelweed and skunk cabbage. That was a big thing.
Oh my gosh, they'll take over everything.
I'm partial. I'm weird. I like skunk cabbage. But yeah, so doing it with plants that are a little more hardy, native plants that can survive some more conditions is a good way to start. I know another person put in a raised bed, and they really tried to make a carnivorous plant kind of haven. So it was I think he used a fill of like straight peat or straight sphagnum. So it was very much a low pH sphagnum bog essentially that they created. But I think that's a great point, that you really need to know the plants that you're trying to include and create conditions that are attuned to that. Or, you can go the opposite route of that too and just say, I'm going to plant the easy natives that'll grow anywhere and go that route.
As for like soil testing and your water testing, there are definitely a lot of kits. I have a soil testing kit, pretty old, so it's not as reliable. So getting stuff that's up to date. And they're also, you can send out your soil samples to a lab, have them test it. You can do some like very cool like hand test too, to see physically what your soil is kind of looking like. And that organic material, your organic matter is going to add a lot to kind of like get those fungal associations too. Because mycorrhizae kind of takes where it wants to be. You can't really add it. You can use it, and they add it to some like soils and fertilizer. At least, do you have any more on the kind of mycorrhizae?
I don't. It's also kind of an understudied field too. And as far as bringing that in. I know there's some composts that are like live composts or something that are supposedly supposed to have some of these mycorrhizal associates, but as far as I'm aware, a lot of these mycorrhizal associates are pretty specific to your particular plant. So yeah, it's important to know exactly what your plant needs. A lot of the orchids that we grow also rely on mycorrhizal associates at some point in their lives. So it might also be a case where if you don't have these, the plant might not die, it might just not be as hardy as it would otherwise be. And in a cultivated setting, you might be able to, keep it alive and allow it to grow and thrive, but it might not be as vigorous as it would be in the wild.
A great example of that is some of the species that we highlighted. Some of them, just in the right conditions, can be very tall, but when you find them, they might be very short. It depends a lot on nature and what's going on and the
Sure.
conditions.
Yeah, for sure.
Are there any other questions, comments, stories?
I actually, last year, I was weeding in my front yard under some hemlocks, and I found this strange looking plant, and I said, it was in flower, and I said, that's an orchid. What could it possibly be? And I looked it up, and it turned out to be a helleborine, which I had never heard of before. And so it's a weed. And okay, that's fine. It's a weed. It's an orchid. I've got it growing there. And the little thing disappeared, never came up again. Just 1 year, one plant gone. And
Emily.
which is, yeah.
这样你不动啊？
Hello? Oh, which is not very good performance for a weed. I mean, they are supposedly actually in some places, I think in some places in Wisconsin, regarded as an invasive weed, and people tear them out. I mean,
Yeah,
they're not very spectacular, but they're orchids.
That's for sure. And that's a great point too. There are some non-native plants or even some native plants that can become invasive in the, I guess, wrong circumstances too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's been my experience too with the helleborine, that they kind of show up randomly 1 year and sometimes they bloom, sometimes they don't, but they're not really too much of an issue.
Yeah. And then in other places they are. It's strange. Yeah.
Yeah, depending on where you are.
I know. When I lived in New Hampshire, I had pink lady slippers growing on the property, which was great. And then I moved here and I'm looking and the soil isn't really that much different. And the trees, it's kind of the same mix. So why don't I have the lady slippers? But they supposedly they are essentially non-transplantable. The mycorrhizal association, which I think is them and the fungus and the trees, is so complicated that you just basically can't move them. Which is unfortunate.
That's a great point, though, of like why you need to get them from these ethically kind of sourced nurseries, because some people think that you can just go outside and dig it up, and a lot of places that's actually illegal. So if you're on state, federal land,
Oh yeah,
it's illegal to dig an orchid, but it's also just gonna die. That's a big misconception that, like, throughout all of history of people just going and walking into the woods and grabbing baskets and digging them up and thinking they could sell them. It's such a waste and a pity.
Yeah. But they do turn up in unexpected places. I mean, I haven't seen very many wild temperate orchids, but I remember one time we were in Nova Scotia and I took my dog out for a walk at the motel to get out on the back lawn, and the boundary of the back lawn was just a
这个
straight
剩的你
line
看，你先吃，我忘了你要煮米饭了，开始了。
where they had mowed, so it was grass and then weeds, and right in the weeds were purple fringed orchids. They were just there growing in the back of the motel.
Yeah, they show up in unexpected places for sure.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Could you put the slide back up where you source how to find the orchids in New York State. Like there was a county by county map. I can't quite read it all. So I don't even know how to get started with doing that search.
Yeah, I've got it up for you. And this will also be this this whole presentation is going up on YouTube. So it will be
Yeah, I know, but
Thank you.
I can't read it. I can't read the screenshot, like, so I can't read all the things where it says,
What part?
I don't know, go to whatever search
New
thing
York.
for,
New York Flora Atlas.
yeah, the atlas,
Yeah, that's what I would search for, would be the Flora Atlas.
Yep.
just,
You
just do-
can Google it and it should be the first response. I think
so just Google New York Floral Atlas.
Flora.
Flora.
Flora. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, there you go.
You
I
can
wrote
also
it down
use-
when we were there.
You can also use Go Botany too. They have good resources, but they're mainly shifted towards New England. So New York isn't really included in there, but
Yeah.
a lot of similar plants.
Yep, I just Googled it and it was the very first thing that came up.
Okay,
So,
good.
yep.
All right, being blind, being blinded old.
That's all right. And then we got a comment here that we need to do some more field trips. So we need to go out orchid hunting. I agree with that. We need to lead some trips around. That'd be fun.
Yep.
Is there a kind of a high season for blossoming? I mean,
Depends
I
on
know
the
it depends
type.
on- Yeah,
It's
but
it's
is
really specific.
I've used iNaturalist to find my first ones in the area.
iNaturalist is a great resource
Yeah,
too.
because I went over to Pine Bush and saw where somebody has been documenting every year when they see some. So I went over there and knew exactly where to find them.
Yeah.
And then
yeah.
I found out that somebody had found hellebore across the street from me. And so I
wow.
waited to, and it said what time, because they take pictures. So it gives you the month and everything that they took the picture. So you know kind of when to go look. So, you know, the rarer ones, they don't give exact locations. The more common things, they give you a good location to look. So
Yeah, that's a great resource that we didn't add in this, but we should have. Wasn't thinking. And iNaturalist too will give you a blooming time or a kind of distribution of when the most records are submitted. But yeah, thank you, Kim.
great. So if there's not anything else, we'll set you guys free. Thank you for joining us and learning about native orchids and hearing us talk all about it. We hope that you can go out and do some botanizing yourself and find some of these great plants that New York has to offer.
Yeah.
Thank you
Getting
for
out
doing
and
it.
thank you guys. Thanks.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you for sharing that.
great. Okay, bye.
Have a good night.